Hello! Every year that I go to Agile on the Beach, Steve Smith is there. He's a consultant, he's a very tall man, he has a very dry sense of humour, and his talks are always very popular. And I've never been to any of them, so this year I made a point of going to one of them to hear about him talking about continuous delivery and the theory of constraints. And it's very good, so I thought I should share some of what I learned with you. Talk's about 40 minutes long. I've got about 5 minutes, so I'll be a little bit briefer and less funny. So continuous delivery and improving continuous delivery is about increasing your throughput of your delivery systems to meet demand from the market. That is, to be able to deliver software and changes to software as quickly as your market or your consumers need it. Trying to do it any faster than that might be a waste. There might be other benefits to things that you can do to speeding it up, but in terms of improving continuous delivery, you don't really need to be doing anything faster than the demand from your market. Steve talked about an anonymous mobile network that he worked at many years ago, which had a deployment system that looked a lot like this. Might look familiar to people, it's not that unusual. And the lead time from something being checked into version control to it finally being in production for customers to use was around 34 days. And they got him in as a consultant to work with their teams to try and reduce that lead time. And they had a target of bringing it down to 14 days. And they looked at all of the different technology things that they were doing and the best practices that people know about and identified the ones that they were already doing. And then over the next 18 months or so, they introduced a load more technology practices. Sorry about the extra bits on the edges of the slides. This is where I screen captured it all from his Vimeo talk from another conference. They also looked at organisational changes they could make and looked at the things that they were already doing and introduced some more changes. And over the course of about 18 months, they took the 34-day lead time and reduced it to 31 days, which, as you can imagine, was quite underwhelming and somewhat disappointing. And retrospectively, looking back at some of the figures that he had, when he'd learnt some more about these techniques that he shares, he realised that actually the lead time for them on average to get a piece of software from version control into production was longer than the frequency with which they were trying to do releases. So it actually took them longer to release software than the cadence on which they were trying to release it, which was part of the problem and part of the stress. And so to look at how you can improve your deployment process end to end, you might want to look at the work of Eli Goldratt. His book The Goal, which is actually a business novel set in a manufacturing facility, is actually very well worth reading, and it might not sound like it is, but it really is well worth reading. And he talks about the idea of constraints. And a constraint is, actually we'll talk about what's not a constraint. A non-constraint is any step in your process where the available throughput and the capacity exceeds the demand that is placed on it. So any work flowing through this step in your process is not a constraint. Whereas a constraint is any step in your process where the available capacity is less than the demand that is placed on it. And when you have a constraint in your process, work will come in. It might sit in a queue, it might spend time being prepared, processed and assembled in the manufacturing world. In the software world, it tends to be mostly queues and assembly, i.e. deployment. And as you can see, the throughput that's available is less than the demand that's placed on it, and so you constrain the amount of work that comes out of it. It's the next step in the process. So any work that you do to optimize a non-constraint is not going to help you, because the work will pile up in front of the actual constraints in your system. So if you map out the process of your deployment, as Steve did, there's a very small key there, but this was integration testing. Was it integration testing? So this was functional testing, sorry. This took 3 days in their process. Integration testing took 11 days in their process. And then the deployment activities took around 20 days in their process. So he mapped out how long each of the different steps took. And over the course of the 18 months, this just shrinked a little bit by about 3 days. If you include the queue times in those pieces of analysis, you can see that the work that was going into functional testing would sit in a queue for around a day before testing for a couple of days, and then it would go over to integration testing, where it would sit in another queue waiting for someone to pick it up before it spent 10 days being worked on. But when it got to deployment, actually the work just sat there in a queue for 2 weeks before anybody did anything with it. And this was the big source of the delays in their deployment process. And it turns out that the deployment process at that company was such a horrendous ball ache that the deployment manager scheduled all of the deployments months in advance to happen every 2 weeks. So it didn't matter how quickly you made all these other steps. Your software would still sit there waiting for up to 2 weeks, or at least 2 weeks, before it actually got deployed. And this was an insight that Steve wishes he had come to earlier when he was working for that client, rather than retrospectively looking at the data. So Goldratt talks about the 5 focusing steps to find and improve constraints in your system. And the first one is to identify all the different constraints, which involves mapping out your whole process and working out where work might be held up by a step in the process which doesn't have the capacity to deal with the expectations that are put on it. The next step is to, as he calls it, exploit the constraint. And what he means here is to make the maximum use of that constraint. So if you have, say, a test server which is only being used during the 8 hours of the workday, maybe you could work out ways to have that be used 24 hours a day and reduce the amount of time that work has to sit in a queue in front of it. Maybe if you have a test team who are doing manual testing, you might want to make sure that they don't all go for lunch at the same time and get an extra hour of testing out of each day. Ideas like that. The next thing to do is to subordinate everything to the constraint, which is a long-winded way of making sure that you're saying the activities that are happening here and the resources that are needed at this step in the process, that's the only thing they should be doing. So if you've got a release manager who's also got to organise the CAB meeting, who also has to set up the video conferences, who also has to go and chase all the people to attend, and he's not managing the releases itself, see if you can get other people to take all that cruft away from him, and he can focus on those steps and subordinate everything else to the work that's most important in that process. The next step is to elevate the constraint, which essentially means to throw money at it by either hiring more people or buying more machines or buying more software to improve your throughput there. And then lastly, to repeat the process of looking at what your constraints are, finding out what the biggest constraint is, and working through that process again. So the 3 things that you could do to try this on your process is to establish what your target is, look through all the different constraints, find the one where the lead time, or sorry, the process time is longer than your target, and then run some different experiments to see what you could do to save time for that constraint. And the talk was by Steve Smith, so he should get the credit. You can find it on the Agile on the Beach website in a few days, I think. If not, there's one on Vimeo from a conference that he did earlier in the year, back in May. He's written a book on the topic. He's also written a children's A to Z of continuous delivery, which I'd quite like to buy. Yeah, it's very good. Go watch it. That's me.